Hello, everyone, and welcome to our video series on the future of the bioeconomy. I'm Drew Wandzilak, an investor here at Alumni Ventures with Catherine Tubb, the Director of Research at Synthesis Capital. Hello, Catherine. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Drew. Really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, of course. A lot of great research and insight kind of on this space. So we wouldn't have a full bioeconomy deep dive here without your perspective. I think a great starting point for us would be just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, what led you to Synthesis, and maybe a little bit of a background on kind of how Synthesis Capital operates and what you guys are looking at.
Sure. So I guess starting with me, did a PhD in organic chemistry and then kind of went through a traditional finance trajectory in starting off in equity research, where I actually started looking, probably unsurprisingly, at chemical companies. So that really started exposing me in particular to the agricultural chemical companies. So by that, I mean crop protection and fertilizer companies. So K+S, Yara, BASF, Bayer, Monsanto, and Syngenta at the time. And I think that really kind of got me interested in the space because a lot of these companies were very much talking about the future of food, but there were very few of them. There's 6 at the time for crop protection chemicals. I think now there's 4 big companies kind of very much controlling the supply of a really important part of the agricultural supply chain. And I was really struck by how kind of opaque it was in that industry. And then that led me to work at RethinkX, which is a disruptive technology think tank, and specifically looking at kind of the future of food and applying their disruptive technology kind of framework to food and how that could be disrupted in the future. And so that was kind of how I came to Synthesis. I met the founders through that work, and then they invited me to be the Director of Research at Synthesis, which obviously I was very excited to take that position up. And Synthesis, a very large alternative protein focused VC fund with about $300 million US, and from a range of different investors, from institutional investors to family offices, investing purely in kind of alternative proteins and that supply chain. And it was very much born out of the fact the founders had been investing in the space for a number of years and really felt there was a big hole in terms of Series A and B, like people able to lead those kind of rounds with the knowledge. And, as we're starting to see some of those companies really starting to grow and get bigger, we need more of that kind of experienced capital in the space. So that's kind of what happened with Synthesis. And they definitely are very much investing in the supply chain. So we're not going to invest in another Beyond or Impossible. It's very much thinking about the nuts and bolts of what does this new industry look like in the future and how are we going to kind of really help get to where we need to be in 10 years' time.
That's great. And I'm glad you actually brought up Beyond and Impossible, because I think it's an interesting place to start. And we won't talk about those two that much, but I think for the general audience, like that's what people think of when they think about kind of the future of food, alternative proteins. So it might be helpful to almost take a step back and think about why should people care about the future of food? Like, why are we striving for these advancements in food? Kind of what's wrong with our food system right now that it requires someone like a Synthesis to step in and kind of support this entire supply chain of alternative proteins around the future of food. Just kind of, take a step back there and chat a little bit more about that, if you could.
Yeah, I mean, weirdly, how I came into it and how RethinkX thinks about it is not really about kind of what needs to be done to the food system. It comes through it very much as a technology disruption focused story. So if you kind of flip the switch a little bit and kind of think about, well, we've got a load of really interesting technologies that have been coming down in cost, improving in capability, many of those kind of underlying technologies that are really driving forward the bioeconomy, from synthetic biology, computer engineering, all just kind of enabling us to understand biology and program it in a way that becomes scalable. And if you think about that kind of just getting cheaper and better and what that is enabling us to do and make and achieve, and that's really where the kind of starting point of our food disruption story came from. From everything from kind of precision fermentation or recombinant protein production, where you can actually program microorganisms to produce, any protein you want, right? So obviously pharmaceuticals are one part of that, but also food proteins, to kind of cultivated meat. It's starting, if they can come down in cost, they start becoming much more efficient. And that's kind of really what it's about. If you think about the efficiency of our current food system, it's as efficient as it's ever going to get. And is there a way that we can make it 10 times more efficient? That's what biology allows us to do.
I think that's super interesting, because a lot of times when you talk about the future of food, when you talk about alternative proteins, there's always the first point is an environmental one. And I think that's a piece, right? But you touched on their efficiency and like how we can actually have more efficient food supply chains. How much does the environmental piece have an impact, if at all? I mean, because that's a huge thing that people, I think, point towards, but wasn't a big part of of your piece there. And I'm more curious on kind of why, and maybe that's a miseducation kind of part on my end.
Yeah, efficiency for sure in terms of the environment comes into it. So when I talk about efficiency, I think about it in terms of cost, but also inputs and outputs. So obviously with the environment, a lot of how we measure the impact is based on those factors. So, but if you can produce food with fewer of those factors, they are not only cheaper theoretically in cost because you're using less of those factors, but also have a much better environmental profile. So while the technology isn't scaled up yet, so we're not necessarily seeing those in action, there is kind of that thought, well, actually, this is what's going to happen. You're just going to be using a lot less land, you're going to be using a lot less water, you're going to be using a lot less feed than you need, because inherently, if you think about a cow, maybe not chickens, which are quite feed efficient, but if you think about a cow, the amount of land and feed that you need to feed a cow and grow a cow, and time as well, right? It's just so much higher. So if we can improve on those and kind of make nature better, I guess, or build on what nature's already doing and make it even better, that's where the efficiencies come in. And that's environment is definitely part of that story. And especially that's probably, part of why we're seeing an increased focus because of that environmental impact, for sure.
And another piece of that is when we talk about the bioeconomy, even just within the context of food, like people start to picture these things like fermentation. It's all happening in a lab. And in a big case, like it is biology, right? Like a lot of this is happening in a lab, but that original input is still usually, right, happening in an agricultural setting. And you talked about kind of your background and like with Monsanto and just like with chemicals, and you see a lot of people here coming from the oil and gas industry or from the agriculture industry. Can you touch more on like those inputs and maybe kind of what's happened historically because even if with precision fermentation, even with these alternative proteins, there's still an input that's required and that, we as a people of the world need to be able to support. And so what does that kind of currently look like?
Yeah, so something that we do think about a lot is kind of the feedstock for this new kind of industry that's going to grow, right? So, when you're building any biology or any biological substance, it's made of essentially the elements that you and I know: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. So where are you going to get your carbon source? And that's kind of, we know that animals get theirs from kind of the ground, so plants and things like that. When we think about it, we do understand that with fermentation, you're going to be using much simpler sources of carbon, so glucose. So we've definitely kind of thought a lot about glucose production and where that's going to come from, and also have we got enough glucose, right, for this new bioeconomy going forward. And so we've written a lot about that, but also other feedstocks, things like carbon dioxide. There are definitely microorganisms that use carbon dioxide as a feed as well. So can we leverage kind of that as well as a possible feedstock in the future? So there's kind of a few interesting areas of where those feedstocks can come from. I think the good news is in the US that we use so many crops, but a lot of it goes to feed animals or for fuel. So in fact, if you take corn in the US, I think it's literally like 80% of it either goes for fuel or animal feed. So theoretically, there's quite a lot of corn that you could switch over to be used as feedstock for this new bioeconomy. Is it going to be enough? probably not on its own for the future, but if you can like leverage other sources as well, that's important. And that's assuming we don't use biofuels as much and animals kind of disappear a little bit. So
right, and corn, the connection there, corn to kind of that simple glucose that is largely used as like the feedstock, right? And you made the point of like, we're putting a lot of our corn, at least in the US, into feeding animals. That could eventually shift over to some of these alternative proteins, but there's still that gap there. Is the path forward that you see kind of filling that gap with corn, which is a kind of widely grown product? Or you also mentioned some alternatives. What do some of those alternatives look like, and are they kind of realistic? Are they realistic alternatives to kind of support the growing needs of what we're seeing in food?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got, if we think further out, like the immediate one that all these microorganisms use are definitely glucose. So you can get glucose from a lot of different crops, but generally you do get it from corn. But then also, as I mentioned, anything, so carbon dioxide, so they're called C1 feedstocks essentially. So obviously if you can extract carbon from the air and turn it into food, that's the kind of a bit of a holy grail, right? And there's definitely a lot of companies kind of in that space. And then the other aspect I would say is kind of residue feedstocks from other industrial processes. So whether it's food production, vegetable washing, or kind of many other processes, can we kind of recycle that feedstock and make use of it? So that's kind of, I guess, starts lending the idea to a much more circular economy than we have now. So I'd say those are the three main areas of where we think we're going to get the feedstock. I mean, the thing with the crop feedstock, of course, is if you're not using as much land to feed animals, then it kind of does free up a lot of that crop. And you have to also remember that it's a much more efficient process, so you don't need as much of the land to feed the animals. So there is definitely a lot of kind of white space and headroom there, but we've got to get to that point yet. So but I think definitely those three key aspects are all going to be really key in the future of kind of the new food system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some like interesting points there as we think about how the industry is transforming. One of the pieces here that I've talked about with some other folks with is you're dealing with a lot of kind of legacy, long time corporations with any of this, right? Whether it's in food, agriculture, tons of crossover there. What is it going to take, I think, from a market perspective, for people or corporations to kind of get behind this trend? Or is it already happening to a large degree, and we're X amount of years away from having a world that has really efficient food production that maybe isn't animal based? Would love your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're a lot closer than people think, but equally there is a lot to do. I think how we kind of have studied disruption and how it happens, you generally see a few key things kind of really pushing it forward. Because I think if you look at it now and think, oh gosh, there's all these massive legacy companies, there's a really big political, like I would say, tailwind to traditional, the incumbent agricultural system. How are we ever going to kind of overcome it? But if we look at it purely from the idea that if the technology, because it's not there yet, but if the technology improves and the products improve and they get cheaper, because I would say that most of the plant-based options on the market they're not good enough yet. Like they're not good enough for a rational consumer to switch, which is kind of how we measure the rational consumer being a kind of more mass market consumer. So I guess this is a meat eater. So the products aren't necessarily there yet from a technology point of view. They're not there from a cost point of view. But if they can get there, and that's the point when the rational consumer switches, then that's when the whole system will change. And that's when mass market adoption happens. I also think there's a way too much focus on the consumer, as in you or I, in this disruption. We definitely think it's going to be a much more ingredient or B2B led disruption. So if you're thinking about those big corporations, obviously a lot of the big corporations are actually acting in the middle of the supply chain. They're not really the farmers. But if you're thinking of the big kind of food processors, the big food companies, for them, these inputs are essentially a cost base. So if they can be cheaper and also they come with like less of an environmental impact, all these kind of aspects, it becomes a bit of an easier win, right? You can kind of see how these food companies would switch to, you know, palm oil not made on a farm. You know, there's also a whole marketing ploy that they can do that makes it a very attractive kind of proposition. But to get to that point, we obviously have to prove out the kind of commercial scale, get there with the tech. And I would say that's more the barrier at the moment. But if we can persuade those companies, I always say that if you do the calculations, about 10% of cheese in the US is eaten on a pizza. So you don't have to persuade the pizza eaters, you have to persuade the people that make the pizzas to put the cheese on the pizza, right? So that's kind of how I view it a little bit, which is maybe a bit different to some people.
Sure. I mean, I think it does. It takes a little bit of the responsibility in a realistic sense away from the consumer, right? Like many places in that supply chain where decisions are made that I think are really important for kind of seeing this industry move forward. Kind of thinking about those.
Which has been the problem as well, right? That people feel their choices are taken away from them. But I think if you think about it in the terms of this disruption, it becomes a much more compelling story when you think about who you're actually trying to persuade.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of those barriers, and it is a compelling story, right? Like I think people that hear this go, great, like more efficient kind of food supply chains. There's an environmental benefit to this. You know, even like carbon from the air to create food is like the holy grail, right? So all these things are super compelling. What are you thinking about these barriers, thinking about the next decade or so? What are you the most concerned about realistically in kind of getting to this point of price parity, getting to consumer and kind of, you know, business adoption?
Yeah.
And what are you the most optimistic about kind of in the next decade or so?
I mean, I'm pretty optimistic about everything, and the fact that I think because the ecosystem has changed so much and there's so many companies, even since kind of 2018, you know, 17, 16, when there were really only a handful of companies in this space. And it feels like in that 5 years, we've seen such an explosion in the number of companies across the whole supply chain. So it's not just kind of a proof of, you know, hey, can we actually do this? Can we program a microorganism to produce a milk protein? Can we, you know, make cultivated meat? It feels like we're actually starting to move much more into, hey, can we commercialize this? Like, what are the bits of the supply chain that we need to build out? So I feel like the industry is moving along, but it's not moving that fast, and it concerns me around kind of regulation and commercialization is going to be slow, because ultimately these are quite capital intensive processes. So it's not like a software as a service business. You can't scale up super quickly. It's very much you have to get that capital in order to build the plants. And I think I've done some analysis looking, kind of comparing like how EV supply chains took off compared to what we might tell us about alternative proteins. And I think what we saw with electric vehicles was a real buy-in from kind of government and industry. But to get to that buy-in, you need to really show that the technology is de-risked. And to de-risk the technology, you need the capital to kind of build it out. And you still need to get there in terms of the technology being cheaper and good at better and all those kind of things. So I think for me, when I look at it from a whole, I'm like, okay, look, these things are happening. When I start focusing in on kind of scale up or regulation or cost or capability, I get a bit more, it feels like a much bigger task. But I feel like when you kind of take a step back and look at it all together, it does feel like it is moving in the right direction. But I think how we think about it is in terms of the adoption, like any of those things can act as a brake. So while we're quite aggressive in terms of, we see a slow adoption happening much slower at the beginning, which is kind of typical of an S-curve adoption. You see it as being a much slower takeoff than people expect, and then much faster. What can kind of slow down or act as brakes is kind of things like regulation and scale up and commercialization, which are a little bit, while there's lots of people working with governments and things, it feels like it's a switch, right? It's going to happen or it's not going to happen. So when that happens, it becomes a little bit more kind of, I guess, stressful. Kind of sitting back because I have no control over it.
Yeah, and understanding that there, to your point, there's a ton of pieces here that I think will be catalysts or barriers to adoption more broadly. Is there a point in there, or is there a part of that you kind of zero in on? And maybe it's from the EV comparison that you feel like could really be a big unlock if you could solve it? Is it regulation? Is it, government funding? Is it some of the big corporations kind of signing in with large amounts of capital investment or whatnot? Is there a big piece that's like, if we could all get together and like make happen somehow with with the magic wand? Is there a piece that you would focus on?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I think it's the kind of Tesla moment, which EVs had. And what I mean by that is someone came into the market and said, oh my goodness, we can produce a sports car that's premium with a really long range battery and people want to buy it. So if you kind of translate that into alternative, and that was, by the way, remember that electric vehicles have been around for 100 years. In 1900, there were 40% of cars in the US were actually electric, but the battery issue has kind of been a continued problem. But the car companies have been working on it, just haven't really got anywhere, and so they'd almost dismissed it. So suddenly someone coming in and going, oh look, I've done it. It was like such a big moment that it was like everyone went, oh, it can be done, and kind of always had to race to catch up. And I kind of see that as a similar. I'm not saying that we want this premium car out there for alternative proteins, but I'm saying like it's almost the proof of like a company saying, hey, look, we've commercialized this and we can produce it, and here it is on your plate and people will eat it. I think that's almost the key moment that we need. And once you can show that, I think then the things like the government support and industry funding will follow. So for me, it's very much that kind of tech de-risking that needs to be done.
I think no, sorry, go ahead.
And also I think what the more interesting thing about food is I think there's a few different technologies at play going on in terms of the different ways that we could produce food, from like fermentation to cultivated meat to plant-based, and even like single cell fermentation, so mycoprotein and things like that. So there's kind of a number of different technologies working in tandem as well. And I think how they come together to produce like really interesting food is kind of something that I think the next 5 years will be quite fascinating.
It's incredible. And I love the comparison with the EV market, and I'll be excited to kind of read or watch what comes out of that analysis on that delivering the Tesla moment, because that's something that like in VC, like we're generalists, like we hear that all the time, right? In other industries.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really great point to make. Any prediction on your end, like what that Tesla moment would look like for alternative proteins?
Yeah, I think the interesting one. Sorry, my battery's running low, so I'm just gonna. The interesting moment, I guess, the one that's most immediate that is kind of happening in the next year or so is perhaps cultivated meat scale up. I think that's kind of could be a moment if kind of Upside with their facility can start producing this product. I think that could be interesting, but I don't want to say, hey, that's the Tesla moment, because it almost seems too obvious. I feel like maybe a Tesla moment has to be something a bit more out of kind of left field, but I think that is certainly a big moment. Like that's, people are watching it. And I think to be honest, there's a lot of companies who are much more aware of the space than, a lot of them have got kind of CVC ventures and stuff like that. So they're kind of aware of it. So I think people are just waiting for the technology to be de-risked. So I do think actually you could see a lot of cash coming into the market at that moment across the number of technologies, but they're just waiting at the moment, rightly so, as they did with electric vehicles, right? Yeah. Even with electric vehicles, we're seeing catalyzation from the IRA and IIJA of so much funding, more than has ever been already. I think they've got pledged for the next 10 years more funding than we've seen in the last 30 in electric vehicles and the supply chain. So the money will come, but it's just kind of, getting to that tipping point, I guess.
I think that's a really great point, is that, and this is happening, I think, in a lot of industries, but especially here, it's like the money is almost waiting on the sidelines for the technology to catch up. And so it's not always like at fault of the corporations that they're not adopting alternative proteins as fast as maybe some people would want. It takes time with any new technologies, like new biology, new hardware. So I think a really, really nuanced point. Um, the last question,
Which of course is
yeah,
DC, right? It's that valley of death that we're basically about to start that valley of death process with alternative proteins. Um, so that I think the good thing is that you'll see really strong companies, I think, starting to rise to the top, which is also what the space needs a little bit. I mean, you mentioned Beyond and Impossible at the start, and I think we have seen a lot of startups that are not necessarily technologically differentiated. And I think that's something we want to see, that technological differentiation in our companies for sure.
I think it's a great point. Um, and then the last thing here is really, you talk about the future of food. That's what you focus on most of the time. The audience of this is everyone, right? So people that maybe are in the food industry, but people that, maybe don't even know about Impossible or Beyond, or maybe that's their only foray into like the future of food. What's kind of the one or two things that you want to say to those people, whether it's a misconception, it's something that you feel like people can do at a personal level, or just something that I think is exciting or really compelling about this whole sector of the future of food, and why people should be excited.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always say to people, let's kind of move away from this discussion of what if to let's assume that it happens. And you can go back through history. I've got loads of examples on our blog posts of my favorite is artificial ice, the destruction of ice, natural ice by artificial ice. So spoiler alert, we all have artificial ice nowadays. So I think if you move away from that idea of, okay, I guess the ick factor, because food is so subjective and emotional. We make those choices 3 times a day, if not more. So I think that moving away from that kind of immediate factor to actually what happens if this technology does get better and does improve and gets cheaper and more efficient, what does that mean? Because I think there's so many possibilities, not just for food, but for the whole bioeconomy, right? And arguably food is kind of almost the lowest rung on the barrier, rung on the ladder, that not the lowest, I guess the highest, is the hardest to get to in terms of cost.
Sure.
But when there's a lot of other ways to get there, right, in terms of materials and cosmetics and HPC. So there's kind of almost whole other aspects that are going to also be really interesting to play in. But yeah, back to the point is, I think if you change that framework to what happens if, how can I prepare myself, and I think have that view of like, okay, what does the future look like? It's going to be a delocalized food supply, that has huge impacts kind of across geopolitics for different regions. If regions can all be kind of food self-sufficient, that kind of changes the argument. If we're thinking about energy as being a delocalized system in the future as well, from solar, it kind of all starts tying into each other a little bit more. And there's these could be these huge impacts, right? And many that I probably don't think about enough, but I think start changing the framework and thinking about that, and that as investors, I think that can kind of help your view for the future. Because that's the other thing, these disruptions are not happening in silos. If you're like completely for renewable cars or renewable energy or autonomous cars, this is going to be part of that as well. So I think that's what I would say to people if you're feeling a bit ick, but kind of take a different framework. So try and step over that ick factor a little bit.
What happens if, not just what if. I love it. I think it's much more exciting and optimistic to think about the possibilities of what happens if. So I think that's,
because there's kind of going to be implications and choices that we have to make when this does happen. And so if we can put in processes and investments now, we'll be in a much better position than if we just try and say, no, we don't want it to happen, we're going to do everything we can to stop it, and complain about it, and then it happens anyway. So yeah.
Absolutely. well, Catherine, this was fantastic. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you were hoping we would, that you want to share any information on?
I mean, the only thing is I'm not sure if I mentioned, like I definitely am not convinced. I definitely don't think the consumer has as much to do with this as perhaps like other companies and things like that. I think yeah, the consumer gets a lot of, and because we are all consumers of food, And we say we all have as many opinions about food as we do about parenting, because that's what we're doing. I think it's hard to remember that those decisions are not necessarily made that much at a consumer level. So what we're eating is a curated choice of food generally, unless you're lucky enough that you can kind of go to your local farm or something. So I think that we do have to think about it more from a kind of business level and corporate level a little bit.
I will ask on that because, and this isn't your job, this isn't necessarily my job, but for someone that listened to this whole thing and went like, oh my goodness, Catherine really fired me up about alternative proteins, and like, I believe this is the future, and they're already in like the what happens if mode. But then they hear you say it's not, the decisions aren't really made at the consumer level, which I understand. What can the individual do to participate in kind of the advancement of the industry here?
I mean, saying that, they have to keep showing up at the supermarket and trialing these new plant-based products and what's on there, because I think that's the other thing, they're constantly changing, right? We make those decisions, as I mentioned, 3 times a day, and therefore one of the things, I guess, the big difference between, say, a decision to buy a car versus food, I tend to get that pushback when we make that comparison, you see. But actually with food, we have the ability to keep trying these products. So we can be really close to seeing how much better and cheaper these products keep getting. So I would say that keep showing up, keep trying brands. If you don't like it, maybe next week it tastes different. So don't dismiss things because you didn't like them. Maybe that's the best way to do it. And keep trying. I mean, I try plenty of plant-based food that I don't like, and still kind of like a piece of tofu, to be honest. So I'm probably the most discerning customer out there, but yeah.
It's good. Okay. Yeah. So it's
and trying products.
That's right. And it's keep trying stuff, have a perspective of what happens if, and I think that leads into trying stuff, right? It's like, if, understanding kind of what your appetite is and critique and share your excitement, and that'll kind of drive things forward. What we can do at a personal level, at least. Well, this was great, Catherine. I appreciate you taking the time and for joining us. Super informative, super entertaining. And I think people will really enjoy it.
Great. My pleasure, Drew. And if anyone wants to contact me, my details can be found on the website, synthesis.capital. So feel free to read some of my musings and reach out.
Yes, please read our musings. They're all, some of them were the impetus of this entire series. So they're worth checking out. And we'll find a good way to make sure those are links and kind of combine the posting here as well. All right. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Drew.